details. First of all, please put your questions in the Q&A at the bottom, and we'll be monitoring that and responding to your questions throughout the webinar, either via a response in the Q&A or feeding those live to our presenters when we need to. And our topic for today is the Bias Project, which uses behavioral economics as a lens to examine human services programs, and particularly those focused to vulnerable individuals, families, and communities. So delighted to have this team here talking about that. And then Barb O'Neill is going to include an overview of some of our extension programs as well. I have been delighted to have Toya Riggins, our national program leader, involved with these. And Toya is going to introduce our speakers for today. So take it away, Toya.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you for your leadership and for the leadership of your incredible team at U of A, Mary Poling and Vonda Nutt. Thank you for your incredible support for this webinar and for the entire series. As you said, I am Toya Riggins, National Program Leader in the Division of Family and Consumer Sciences at USDA's National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of our colleagues across the country. And thank you for joining us for a really informative session today on the possibilities of science-based behavioral insights in improving the impact of our extension work for youth, families, and communities. The purpose of today's webinar is mutual information sharing and identification of future opportunities in this area. And we have three fantastic experts speaking to us today. Amanda Benton is a social science analyst in the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation at the Department of Health and Human Services. She helps support the work by HHS's Administration for Children and Families on a series of behavioral interventions to advance self-sufficiency, or BIAS projects. And they'll be talking about those today. She helps to inform the design and implementation of efforts to leverage learnings from behavioral economics across a variety of human services policy domains. Amanda also serves as the lead analyst for family and youth homelessness, working to streamline and maximize this work both across HHS and with other federal departments. She often represents ASBE on interagency working groups and helps manage an evaluation of housing interventions for domestic violence survivors. Amanda works on family policy issues such as parenting and responsible fatherhood. She's also led HHS efforts to address poverty and child well-being through coordinated technical assistance at the local level. Finally, Amanda contributes to ASBE's work on human trafficking and dissemination strategies for effectively reaching policy audiences. Amanda previously held multiple positions at the National Alliance to End Homelessness, including as Director of Policy Outreach. She holds a bachelor's degree from Dickinson College and a master in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Kim Klum is with us. She's a senior social science research analyst at the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation at the Administration for Children and Families. Her work focuses on low-income adults, economic self-sufficiency, comprehensive reviews of evidence, the application of behavioral sciences to human sciences, and racial and ethnic disparities in human services. She co-leads OPRE's work on behavioral interventions to advance self-sufficiency, which she'll talk about today. Prior to joining OPRE, she held positions in the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation at HHS, where she worked on an array of policy and program areas, including those related to disconnected youth, low-income men, re-entry, and the child support program. Before that, she was at the University of Michigan, where she conducted qualitative research projects on topics related to low-income families, well-being, and mobility. Kim holds a BA, MSW, and PhD from the University of Michigan. And finally, we have our colleague, Barbara O'Neill. Dr. Barbara O'Neill holds the rank of Distinguished Professor at Rutgers University and is Rutgers Cooperative Extension Specialist in Financial Resource Management. She also provides national leadership for the Cooperative Extension programs, Investing for Your Future, and Small Steps to Health and Wealth. A certified financial planner, Dr. O'Neill received her PhD in Family Financial Management from Virginia Tech and has written over 1,700 consumer newspaper articles and over 160 articles for professional publications. She has also received over 3 dozen awards for program excellence and over $1 million in external funding to support her financial education programs and research. And with that, I will turn it over to our esteemed colleagues at HHS.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I really appreciate it. It was very gracious. We're really excited to be talking to you today. I'm just switching on to the slides. Here we go. Sorry, it's just taking a second to get that up. Okay, great. So on the slide, you'll see that we also have our colleague Victoria Kabeck mentioned. Victoria's not able to join us today, but she and I co-lead this work with Amanda from our Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation in the Administration for Children and Families. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce myself and Amanda, and then I'm going to do a little bit of the background work on introducing the big picture conceptual framework of behavioral economics, and then talk a little bit about how we've applied behavioral economics through our work in the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation, which we call OPRE for short. And then Amanda's going to introduce the behavioral diagnosis and design framework and process, which is a process that we kind of specifically developed and applied to help us do this work. And then she's also going to briefly present a framework that describes 7 of the behavioral principles that we have found most consistently useful in the work we've done so far. And then lastly, we're going to come back to me, and I'm going to just tell you a little bit about the new phase of the work that we're currently doing in our office. So just to, first of all, just to give you some context for who we are, who's doing this work. This work is housed out of the Administration for Children and Families, and the Administration for Children and Families is an agency within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Sorry, I didn't actually introduce who Amanda and I were, but sorry, I'll come back to that. The Administration for Children and Families is really the human service agency part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. We feel a little bit often overlooked at HHS because most of the focus for quite a while at HHS has actually been on health care and health services and the provision of health services, but we are actually the second largest agency within HHS, and we provide a vast array of programs, and we have many different offices within our agency. To give you just a sense of the breadth of kind of issues that we cover and the different offices and agencies we have within the Administration for Children and Families, this is just a list of some of them, and they include the Administration on Native Americans, the Office of Child Support Enforcement, the Office of Family Assistance, which is the program office that runs what's commonly thought of as welfare, which is the temporary assistance to needy families. We also cover the Office of Refugee Resettlement and the Office of Trafficking in Persons, as well as many other programs. In my office specifically, so Victoria and I work at the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation, or OPRE. Amanda is our colleague who's in the Office of the Assistant Secretary, Office of Assistant Secretary of Planning and Evaluation at HHS. But our office at OPRE is the office where this work is housed, and we're really the kind of program evaluation office for the Administration for Children and Families. So we conduct and oversee and provide technical assistance on almost all the evaluations of programs that are conducted at ACF. We really try to make sure that those programs run as efficiently and as effectively as they can, and that they're meeting their objectives. And the objectives are to improve the well-being and lives of very vulnerable families, low-income children, low-income adults, and low-income communities. And we do that through a variety of different means, but we tend to try to do the most rigorous research we possibly can, depending on what the existing evidence base is in a particular area. But a lot of our research is done through randomized control trials, for example. So just to kind of get us all on the same page, some of you may be very familiar with behavioral economics, some of you may be a little bit less so, so I just wanted to kind of lay out some groundwork to make sure that we can kind of have this conversation with some common understanding. So if we're starting off, we're thinking about I'm going to present to you 2 different views of human behavior. or human nature. On the left-hand side, we have a representation of Spock. On the right-hand side, we have a representation of Homer. So if you were thinking about Spock and the kind of way we'd think about human nature, if we were thinking about the kind of person that Spock is, we'd say that Spock is not somebody who makes decisions based on his gut. Instead, he seeks out a lot of information about a situation. He's very good at processing that information. He's very stable and predictable. We're not constantly surprised at how he's going to act or react to things. He's able to exert remarkable self-control. He's not very easily swayed off course, and he's very rational. On the right, if we were thinking about Homer and the kind of person he is, we'd say, well, he has pretty limited attention. He seems to very easily get overwhelmed. He doesn't seem to be able to kind of weigh the consequences very well of different decisions and what the consequences of those decisions will be. He gets very easily overwhelmed by too many choices. He's not very disciplined. He gets distracted, and he tends to procrastinate. So the reason I'm presenting these two different views of human nature is that the one on the left, the image of Spock, is actually the way in which traditional economics has kind of conceptualized how human beings behave and act. They assume, traditional economic theory has assumed we're highly rational, that we're always maximizing our kind of well-being or our outcomes by making very informed and rational decisions. But behavioral economics has actually taught us that we're unfortunately all a lot more like Homer than we might like to acknowledge or recognize. So really this view of this kind of Spock view of human nature has really dominated our understanding of economic behavior actually for centuries. And many of our public policies and programs are designed with that view of human nature in mind. But behavioral economics draws on psychology, specifically cognitive psychology and social psychology, to give us a much more realistic understanding of how human beings process information, what kind of things influence the decisions that we make, and then ultimately how we behave. So one of the things that's so innovative about behavioral economics, as opposed to the traditional view of economics, is that behavioral economics developed its understanding of how humans process information, make decisions by actually observing how humans do that process. So traditional economics is really much more of a conceptual model. It's kind of an idealized vision, and it was really developed out of kind of decades of theory. But behavioral economics really started much more by integrating lab-based experiments with kind of larger understandings of how the human brain can process information and the kind of things that can make the kind of mental shortcuts that we tend to use when we're making decisions and influence, and the kind of things that influence in making those decisions. And the really great thing about this is that if we kind of incorporate these insights that we're learning from behavioral economics, we can design programs and policies to be much more aligned with how we know that human beings actually act and behave. And that way we can make those programs actually work better and be more effective in achieving their outcomes. So I'm just going to introduce, and I want to do this pretty quickly because we don't have a lot of time, and some of you may already know some of this, and Amanda's also going to do a great job of coming back to this in a little bit more context. But these are just some really kind of illustrative things we've learned from behavioral economics, some things that, and we highlight some of these in particular because we've found that many of these have applied in our work that we've been doing. But the first one at the top is if you were to take away one message about what's the most important thing you'd want to know that we've learned from behavioral economics or the influence of behavioral sciences on economics, you would say that we have learned that humans have a very finite ability to process information. And unfortunately, we kind of assume that many of the ways our public policies and programs are designed is they're designed assuming that we have like unlimited capacity to process information, and that always is going to trip us up because our finite capacity for information means that when we're expending it to do one thing, we actually have less of it to do something else. So the top one here, the picture of the gorilla on the right and the jars on the left, the gorilla is referencing a very famous set of experiments that have been done that show you through watching videos just how selective our attention really is. And if you haven't already seen these on YouTube, you can look them up really easily, and they're really informative. But they're basically about how if you're asked to pay attention to one thing, and you're honing in on this one thing, in this case, the videos are set up to watch a bunch of people playing basketball, you can miss something so obvious and so big. It's like you would think conceptually it's impossible to miss it, but you will miss it because your attention is just so honed in, and you don't have the attention to process all the other things that are coming at you. So in the case, there's a YouTube video, people are playing basketball, and there's a gorilla that walks across the stage while the people are playing basketball. And if you don't know that you're looking for a gorilla in the video, I'll tell you that experimental science has shown that you will absolutely miss seeing the gorilla. The jars just reference the fact that similarly, choices work the same way in terms of we have a finite amount of ability to process information. So when we have too many choices, we get overwhelmed because it's too much information. Every time you have to make one choice, deciding against one thing versus another, you're actually kind of depleting the amount of attention you have to make a choice. So the jars of jam, if you go into a store and there's an overwhelming display of 24 different kinds of jam, you are actually less likely to walk out of that store having purchased jam than if you go into a store and there's just a display of 6, because the 6 is enough, is like, you can process that amount of information and you'll come away feeling like you've made a good decision, and 24 just kind of overloads. Another really key principle is the present bias. And present bias just means that even when you value something that's very important to you in the future, whatever's immediately in front of you tends to always take precedence. So even when, for example, I always want to be doing more exercise than I currently do, and also I'll set my alarm for 5:45 in the morning. But when my alarm goes off at 5:45 in the morning, the immediate present of getting more sleep versus my long-term goal of completing more exercise makes me much more likely to turn off my alarm and actually be able to orient myself towards my future goal. The next one is that small factors can have a very outsized impact on how we actually make decisions and then behave. Channel factors are small factors that can kind of influence us to kind of go in the direction of a certain decision. So if you even do a little bit of if you've sunk a little bit of time into something, like when you've started to fill out a form, you're more likely to complete the form once you've started. Or similarly, if you have kind of made an a priori commitment to something, you're more likely to follow through. A hassle factor is the opposite. It's the small little things that can kind of get in the way of you completing something. So even though I said once you started to fill out a form, you're more likely to complete it, if the form requires you to have some background information that you don't immediately have at hand, like for example, to know your social security number or to prove what your last pay stub information had, that hassle factor that's involved in filling out the form actually makes you less likely to fill out the form. But you can get around those hassle factors by encouraging people to make plans about completing something and then helping prompt them to complete those plans. So the implementation prompt is a device that you can use to kind of, somebody has made out a plan and you can kind of intervene at certain well-timed spots to get them to complete help get them to complete the plan. Sorry, just a second. This other piece is social influence and identity. And that just refers to the fact that we are very influenced by what other people around us are doing, especially if they're people that we esteem or that if we're in any ways think it's kind of the majority of people are doing something. We're also very primed by different aspects of our social identity. And so a classic example of this has been tested out with electricity bills. So there have been studies done that have shown that if you send somebody an electricity bill and show them how their electricity usage compares to other people in their neighborhood or other people in their community, their usage of electricity can be influenced by knowing that they're expending more energy than other people in their neighborhood. They can decrease their electricity usage. a common way in which we're all being primed these days in terms of one of our social identities is that if you go and stay at a hotel, they often now have signs in the bathroom, that please reuse your towel, hang it up and don't need it when they come in and clean your room. If you have it hung up, they won't replace it. And that's priming your identity as somebody who's either cares about the environment or somebody who conserves energy or is just not wasteful. And then the last piece is just that people are much more motivated by losses than by gains, which is actually counterintuitive. We kind of think that we're more motivated by the idea of like, oh, if I'll complete this thing and I'll give you $50, but we're actually more motivated by the idea if we think we already have the $50 and someone's going to take it away, or if we don't complete something, we'll lose the $50. That's more likely to motivate us to do the action than the gain. And this last piece I'll just mention is something that we found because of our work. Our work is completely focused on very disadvantaged populations, so low-income children and families and individuals. And this is a kind of a newer piece that's being integrated into behavioral economics, which is the psychology of scarcity. And it's really that any time that people are in a situation where they have a real scarcity of something that's very important to them, so in the case of poverty, a scarcity of economic resources, that really winds up acting as a constant kind of depletion on their ability to have attention for processing new and complex information. It just refers to the fact we call that cognitive bandwidth, that you have a limited capacity, a limited amount of attention for being able to kind of process information around you. So now I want to just turn to how this conceptual framework, which I kind of very quickly went over and introduced, how we've actually applied that to research that we've done at our office at OPRE. So we had been hearing about all this really exciting and interesting work that was going on in behavioral economics. A lot of it had been, a lot of the experimentation that had been done around it in other areas, like a lot of actually energy utilization, as I kind of mentioned, and a lot of financial planning information has been and a lot of marketing actually have been areas where there's been a lot of development of behavioral economics applications, but nobody had really applied it to human services. And so we decided that we wanted to figure out how we could apply this body of these conceptual pieces and figure out how we might be able to use them to make our programs more effective. So we wanted, because we're an office where we do very rigorous kinds of research, we wanted to do this in a very rigorous kind of way to figure out not just conceptually what it meant for us to do this work, but what could be the impacts on our programs if we were to apply it. So we undertook this area of work, we call it the Behavioral Interventions to Advance Self-Sufficiency, or BIAS. And our first main project started in 2015, and we wound up doing a total of 15 different tests. They were done in 3 different areas of our work. One is called work support, and that is either programs that are designed to help link people to employment, or programs. Another program was the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit program. We wound up doing a linkage with them. Another area where we did this was child support. And the third area that we did it was childcare. And in the work support one, we wound up doing it to see if we could increase the number of people who showed up at an informational meeting, or who showed up for specific meetings they needed to attend for their to be part of the program that they were in. In child support, we did interventions that were designed to try to increase the number of people who were paying their child support orders on time, or either increase the number of people who were applying to modify their child support orders. So they had child support orders that were set, but the orders were set at a higher level than their income reasonably meant that they would be able to pay. So we were trying to right size their orders. And in childcare, we were trying to increase the number of people who recertified their child care eligibility on time. At the time in most states, they had to recertify every 6 months. And so but a lot of people fell off because they weren't able to get their paperwork in within the 6 months. So this was try to increase the number of people who were successful in recertifying. And the other experiment that we did was to try to increase the number of people who were using higher quality childcare providers. In these 15 tests that we wound up doing, we wound up having a sample size combined across all these 15 tests of over approximately 100,000 people. And we were able to do randomized control trials in these 15 different tests. Now I'm going to switch it over to Amanda. So let me just put myself on mute, which I may need to stop sharing in order to do that, and I'll just switch it over to Amanda.
Great, Kim. Can you do the slide still? Perfect. So a critical part of bias is understanding the behavioral diagnosis and design process. So each site in bias used this 4-stage process, which is really systematic, trying to connect the problem, hypothesized bottleneck to kind of for a participant to go through a process and reach a desired outcome, and then a proposed intervention. So the first step is define, and that step is really about defining the problem neutrally, where you don't have a solution baked in, and you kind of don't presume to know the reasons for the problem before you do a diagnosis. And the problem should be precise enough that you can actually test it and sort of measure it. The second stage is diagnose, and that's really about understanding from start to finish what the process looks like to reach your desired goal. So you do this huge comprehensive investigation into a problem and its potential causes to really understand where in a process that a participant is going through might the kind of process break down. What are the bottlenecks that could exist that could stop them, you know, for example, from getting from step 3 in the process to step 4, trying to understand what's happening there. And then put it all together into a behavioral process map where you link the hypothesized bottlenecks with behavioral concepts. So then the third phase is the fun one, where you get to design an intervention using the process map you just put together and drawing on behavioral economics literature. And then fourth is to test and really trying to understand if that's working better than the existing process and the status quo, and which components of the new interventions work best to produce those outcomes, and if you can fine-tune it over time. So to make that a little more explicit, I'm going to walk through a concrete example from bias. Los Angeles County had a TANF program that had exempted a number of parents from being engaged in the program, but that exemption ended and they need to get parents kind of back into the program. So we defined the problem as increasing the number of parents who attended that initial scheduled appointment. We tried to make it neutral as possible. Some of the parents were going to qualify for different exemptions, for example, if they were homeless. So we didn't want to make it about engagement as the solution and sort of bake that in. So we sort of tried to craft it neutrally about getting to the meeting and then figuring out the right next step from there. So then the second phase is diagnosis. And I know it's a little hard to see, but basically you, again, we looked at all this administrative data, we talked to a lot of the stakeholders and tried to develop this process map to kind of map through. And so on the left, you'll see you have sort of a more typical process map. And then on the right, you have these hypothesized behavioral bottlenecks. So, you know, the steps in the process are basically that the LA TANF agency schedules a re-engagement appointment, and then they send a 60-day reminder letter, which the participant has to open and understand. Then there's a 30-day letter that the participant has to open and understand. Then the participant has to decide they're going to actually attend the meeting. Then they have to remember the appointment. Then they have to arrange childcare and transportation. Then they have to actually attend the appointment. And then at the end, kind of doing whatever the necessary follow-up is. So looking across all of those, we came up with a total of 6 behavioral bottlenecks. The first one being that the letters that they were sending were really complex and long. I'm sure you're all kind of familiar with some of the bureaucratic government letters. And so as Kim was talking about, a potential bottleneck is that it'd be really hard for participants to focus. It might be too much information to process. A second bottleneck was that participants were used to getting these benefits without actually being engaged in the program. And so they might value not going to the meeting now in the short term over the kind of possible future loss of benefits, or what we call the ostrich effect, which I like, sort of burying your head in the sand and not wanting to think about the potential unpleasant changes coming. They might plan to attend but forget or change their mind. They might plan to attend but find it's hard. You know, they need to arrange childcare. It takes 4 buses to get over to the program office. They don't know the schedule of buses near that part of town, so they don't have all the information they need. Or maybe they're fighting with the utility company about turning the heat back on and sort of decide to prioritize that more pressing concern over going to some meeting. And the others was that because they weren't engaged in the program, they hadn't been workers in a while. And so we hypothesized that some participants might feel kind of psychological concerns about whether they could succeed in the workplace or not. So then we designed this intervention. It's a much simplified letter that we added to the existing packet, sort of very streamlined. There was an implementation prompt as well to kind of walk folks through it. We also personalized the letter, and so had a sticky note specifically calling out their name. And then we did 2 versions of the notice, one that was sort of a loss framed, don't miss out, you could lose up to $2,500 in benefits, and one that was a gain framed message, take advantage, kind of keep up to $2,500 a year in benefits. And so the key with all of this is that the components of the intervention map back directly into the hypothesized behavioral reasons that we identified in that diagnosis phase. So just for example, one of the bottlenecks we identified was the complex materials and the cognitive load and limited attention, so we simplified the materials. We also thought folks might plan to attend but forget, so we used the implementation prompt to help them remember and overcome those hassle factors. So did it work? Yes. We found that the additional behavioral notice did increase re-engagement at 30 days. And importantly, that effect was really driven by the loss framed notice, which increased re-engagement by 4.4 percentage points. So I would just say overall, the thing about behavioral economics is that the effects can be pretty modest. And if you go to the next slide, you know, it's pretty typical of this field to see effects of 2 to 4 percentage points, sometimes much larger, but they're often very inexpensive, and so you can sort of add those up. So with each bias intervention, it was highly tailored using that diagnosis phase to the kind of particular site context, but retrospectively, we went ahead and looked back across all those bias tests and identified some common bottlenecks, which we used to develop this simpler framework that you see on the screen, and which I have to admit we're kind of proud of for coming up with. So simpler is not meant to kind of encompass the full range of the behavioral techniques that are out there, but we think it's a useful starting point as you sort of think about how to apply behavioral insights during that design phase of behavioral diagnosis and design. So S is for social influence, which Kim talked about. And is this the idea that society and peers and sort of folks of influence can affect our decisions and actions, and we follow and mimic what others are doing. So 9 out of 10 dentists recommend this toothpaste. That's trying to use social influence. And in the bias Texas test, we were trying to encourage incarcerated parents who owed child support to submit applications to modify that child support order so they wouldn't build up debt and be discouraged from working and paying child support when they got out. So we used this outreach material that said other parents like you have had their orders lowered. And that intervention, which combined that social influence and some other behavioral elements, did increase the percentage of parents who submitted applications. The I in simpler stands for implementation prompts, which we've talked about, kind of encouraging people to take really specific steps they need to get from to complete a task and move from intention to action. So helping you remember at the right moment, in the right circumstances to do something, as we saw with the childcare and transportation prompts in the Los Angeles example I just went through. That takes us to M, which is make deadlines. And I think if any of you are like me, it's sort of, I think we all know that without a fixed deadline for accomplishing a task, sometimes it can be easy to assume we'll get around to it eventually, and we end up procrastinating. So setting that deadline can kind of frame the activity as important and something that's time sensitive and help us focus our attention and prioritize today's interests and needs over sort of future less pressing concerns. key is for personalizing materials or giving customers personal assistance when doing a difficult task. So for example, I might ignore a letter to residents, but if the letter has my name on it, I'm more likely to open it and engage. You can personalize both written communications and case management meetings. So you could think about using individualized staff support to kind of help families at key moments in time. And agencies also in bias use personalization to use administrative data to pre-populate forms with personal information where they could. So L is for loss aversion, which Kim talked about, sort of this tendency to prefer avoiding losses over equal-sized gains relative to a specific reference point. And we saw that in the Los Angeles example, where it was really that loss frame notice that sort of drove the effect we saw when we did the test. E is for ease, which is the central tenet in behavioral design, that you want to make things as easy as possible, using simple language, using notices that are visually kind of easy to follow, and doing so can increase the likelihood that people will actually follow through and take action. And then R is for reminders, which are really meant about, I think we all can benefit from reminders. Again, it's somewhat intuitive, sort of reducing that mental effort needed by providing this cue that there are tasks that we still have to do. And there's a ton of behavioral research on this in every field from, health to finance to voting and on and on. Almost all of the bias sites employed some form of reminder. Most notably that there were some child support interventions we did in Ohio, where we found that simply sending a reminder, whether it was through phone, text, or robocall, to parents who owed child support and weren't getting any kind of invoice, increased the number of parents who were actually making payments. So I'm going to turn it back over to Kim to kind of wrap up.
Thanks so much, Amanda. Thank you. So to go to the next, so let's back to the screen. Okay. So as Amanda mentioned, out of all the 15 randomized control trials that we were able to conduct, which which Amanda did such a nice job of summarizing some of the key factors we did in those interventions, we were able to get, for each site, they saw at least one significant impact on a primary outcome of interest, which is really, that's, kind of a big deal, because, you don't often find that your interventions that you design and test are actually that consistently positive an impact. And even though the impacts that we saw were generally quite small, so 2 to 4 percentage points, which was, which are very modest, they're also very typical of the field. The field generally doesn't see like big shifts and impacts or big effect sizes, I guess. The fact that they were so consistent and that they were positive was very encouraging to us. It's also the fact that we were doing things that were very modest as an actual intervention. They were not expensive. Most of them involved redesigning letters that people were receiving and then following up with some kind of implementation prompt, usually some kind of postcard or a text. So a lot of it was just redesigning information people received and then doing some basic kind of follow-up stuff. With that very minimal kind of intervention, to see such consistently positive impacts, we thought was really pretty remarkable. And we were very excited to see where we could go next with this. So, but let me just say some of the other things that we kind of, our big picture takeaways from this first phase of work that we did is that we found that regardless of whether or not you actually saw the impacts you wanted to see, just going through the process was really revelatory for program partners. It was really amazing for many people to kind of do a process map that showed them what it was like to go through their program. And not very many program operators get to have that kind of big picture reflection on what their programs are really kind of having people do in order to get through the program. So just even going through that diagnosis and design process, or I'm sorry, the other way around, the diagnosis and design process, sorry, I said that right the first time, was really helpful to programs. The other piece that we found was that, we're an office where doing science, doing evaluations of what we're doing is really important. And we felt very justified for using that approach in this process, because we found out that some of the things we imagined were going to have impacts didn't have any of the impacts we expected. And sometimes they were very counterintuitive. For example, in the site that was about the earned income tax credit, that was a site that was called Paycheck Plus. And we thought that, it's a real hassle for people to have to come into an office to make an appointment to see somebody. So we offered people the option of doing the appointment by phone. And we found that the take-up of the phone appointments was much lower than we anticipated. So doing this kind of testing to figure out what actually is making the difference was really critical. The other piece is that we realized in doing this process that, we think this work is really exciting and really innovative, but it can only address the pieces where there's actually the reason something's not occurring is because there's a behavioral impediment to the outcome that you want to see. In some cases, the outcomes that you want to see are being driven by larger structural impediments, and this behavioral work isn't going to be able to change those. So if there's just like not enough funding to provide a service, or if there's just people don't have, if there's no transportation to get to a specific site or something like that, we're not going to be able to overcome that with this kind of work. But the other thing I just would like to say, I'm sure as many of you know, this is kind of a really growing and expanding field. And though we kind of think of ourselves as being a little bit innovative because we were the first to apply this in the world of human services, now there's lots of folks out there doing similar work to us. So even within our own agency, the Office of Child Support has started its own initiative. There's other agencies in the federal government, the Department of Labor, USDA, which is hosting this webinar, Treasury, a lot of different folks are trying this out with new applications. And then the last thing I'm going to say is just that because we felt so encouraged and we're very excited by the first phase of work that we did, BIAS, we launched a new phase of work that we're calling BIAS Next Generation, or BIAS NG. And we launched this new phase of work to try to go a little bit beyond what we considered the kind of more modest interventions that we had done in BIAS. So we're trying to do things that will change more actual practices with staff or program design pieces. We're also adding a really big implementation research focus to this new work. Before with BIAS, all the data that we relied on was program administrative data or other survey data like UI, unemployment insurance data. But so we were unable to understand really what was happening in the interventions that we had designed in terms of how people were actually experiencing them at the staff or the participant level. So now we're going to be doing some surveys with staff as well as with participants. And then the other piece that we're really focused on is making sure that the work that we're doing really makes sense to practitioners. So the goal of this is to try to, at least encourage people to feel like they have the tools to be able to apply some of this even diagnosis and design work to their own programs, to kind of be able to think critically about how their processes work and where there might be behavioral bottlenecks that they could be addressing. There is this slide that I went over very quickly. I'll just go back to. We have a lot of information on our website. So this slide just gives you some sense of you can learn a lot about the work that we did at BIAS. And we're constantly, as I said, with this new phase of work that we're doing, we're constantly producing new products in different formats. Some of it we're even creating a video to try to promote more information to a broader audience about the work that we did. We have these great behavioral buzz newsletters. We get them out roughly about once a quarter. You can sign up to be on them. They just tell you, they give you some kind of updated work that we're doing in the project, but they also kind of try to talk about larger issues, connect to larger issues in the field. So I encourage you to look to our website for more information. And that's it.
Okay, so this is Barb O'Neill, and let me just share my screen. And you should be ready to go. I hope you can and see it, everything. Okay. Okay, so you might be wondering, well, what does this overview of cooperative extension have to do with the bias program? And the segue really is that we wanted to introduce cooperative extension to our colleagues from HHS and talk about programs. But also, we thought that maybe some of you are new to cooperative extension and might not know about all the programs that we have nationwide, so it'll be benefiting everybody from cooperative extension on the webinar. And then also a third possibility now is, now that we've heard this behavioral finance information, we may look at our programs with a slightly different lens than we've had before, just because of what we've learned about the obstacles and making programs be hassle-free and the personalization and some of the other things that we heard about. So let's get started. Probably the best way to introduce cooperative extension is to talk about the 3 levels of funding, which I'll get to in a minute for another slide, but we'll start with our federal partner. So these were some slides that Toya gave me that just kind of introduces people to NIFA USDA. And this particular slide just explains where NIFA is housed in the organizational chart for USDA, starting with the Secretary of Agriculture and going all the way down to the mission areas where we are a part of. So NIFA is just one of many cogs, I guess, in a big machine, as probably Toya would agree, working there. And then the mission statement for NIFA is to invest in and advance agriculture, research, education, and extension to solve societal challenges. So of course, those of us that are doing work in family economics are primarily concerned about the education and the extension pieces, and trying to improve people's lives with the information that we provide. And then this slide just shows the 3 wheels that are kind of the cogs in the machine of extension, if you will. So we've got the federal cog, we've got the state cog being our land grant universities, and then we've got the local support for cooperative extension that's coming through counties and cities around the country. And depending on states, the funding weightings can be different from state to state, but all 3 levels of government are contributing to the support of our agency, which is kind of unique. You don't have too many government agencies that have funding at all 3 levels. And so what we're all about, of course, is non-formal education. So even though extension is housed in land-grant universities that obviously provide undergraduate and graduate degrees to people, we're providing non-formal education and learning activities for people throughout the country. So what we're doing, of course, is taking the research and the knowledge that comes from our universities and other reputable sources and bringing it directly to people to impact their lives, to make positive changes. So those of us that work in personal finance, of course, we're looking at metrics like people saving money, people reducing debt, preparing for retirement, and other positive financial steps that people would make to improve their well-being. And in cooperative extension, we have state specialists. I happen to do that role here in New Jersey. And then we have county educators who are working at the local level, teaching skills and information to people. So that's just kind of a little bit of an introduction. And of course, those of us that work in extension know that we had our big 100th anniversary a few years ago, celebrating the signing of the Smith-Lever Act, which brought our agency into existence back in 1914. And then we've got this map that just kind of shows our outreach through our entire system. And by the way, if anybody wants a copy of these slides for presentations you might do yourself about cooperative extension, just let me know. I'll be glad to send those out to you. And if we can post them somewhere in the extension, that would be great as well. Probably on the Learn page. So you can just see all the different places where extension is involved. Now, not every county has every program in extension, but there's usually a presence of some sort, whether it's 4-H or agriculture or family and consumer sciences programs. And the program areas that we deal with are pretty diverse. So this slide just talks about the different areas: youth development, agriculture, leadership development, natural resources. Of course, our personal finance and health and nutrition programs are focused in under family and consumer sciences. And then we also do work in community and economic development. And then this slide just has all of our various types of legislation that brought our land-grant universities and eventually cooperative extension into existence. So starting in 1862, when land-grant universities were established, in 1890, establishing additional land-grant universities for historically Black colleges and universities. 1914, bringing into existence cooperative extension. And then 1994 added additional land-grant universities that were part of tribal colleges. So we've had quite a bit of a history over the years. And I guess the biggest thing is for people to find us, and going back to what we just heard about making things hassle-free. So this is just a screenshot of a map that just shows where all of our land-grant universities are. And of course, where our cooperative extension programs are based in states as well. So you'll notice that some states just have one land-grant university. In other states, there may be several. And again, that ties back to the various laws that I mentioned that were passed and how we were kind of established. And as you can imagine, in the South, thinking about the history there were multiple land-grant universities. And then, of course, out in the West, where we have a lot of Native American populations, also a number of those tribal colleges that I mentioned. So that's our map. That's our list that just kind of goes along with that. So this makes a nice handout for programs where people can see exactly where we are. We're going to be using this map actually in an exhibit on Capitol Hill Day in a couple weeks with the Jumpstart Coalition. And then this is the online link that will get people to a local contact so that they can find where their local cooperative extension office is in their state or in their county. So people would go to this link. This is just a screenshot of it. And for example, if they wanted to search out for a program in New Jersey, which is where I happen to be based, they would use the drop-down menu for New Jersey, indicate that they're searching for cooperative extension programs, and then they would do the search, and that of course would bring them up to the page for Rutgers Cooperative Extension, which is the land-grant university in the state of New Jersey. So it's pretty easy for people to find us. If they want to do any finding of us on the national level, of course, Toya is the person to contact, and her information is on that slide. What I'd like to do now is just kind of breeze through some of the programs that we're offering on a national level and resources that might be available to help people make changes in their lives to improve their financial situation. And so what you have here on this slide is just kind of a comprehensive list of the programs that we have, and I'm going to drill through each one by one. So the first thing is obviously us. We're here today. This is our webinar, part of the e-extension personal finance community, otherwise known as the Financial Security for All Community of Practice, or FSACOP. So we are kind of the leadership of personal finance education in cooperative extension. And so we have our monthly webinars, and then we have all the content that we've created on various topics. And we're going back now for about a decade of leadership in combining all the resources that we have from each state into one national network where people can search for information. And then this is just a list of some of our recent webinars, and then we're also active in social media. So the community practice has our Twitter channel, which is @MoneyExtension, where we tweet information about personal finance topics. And then we also have the e-extension Military Families Learning Network, which serves professionals who serve military families, and we have a very small team of 4, and I know Jerry's on this webinar today, part of the team, myself, Marty Gillen from University of Florida, and Molly Herndon, who also works for University of Florida. And so we began developing content in 2012 and had our first webinar then. And we are one of about 8 different concentration areas that do work to, again, provide professional development for people who serve military professionals. And in the last 6 years, we've reached over 12,000 webinar attendees, given out 18,000 plus CEUs free of charge for people to maintain their certifications. And then we've also got some of our webinar titles there as well. Also, we've been involved with blog posts and podcasts as well to get information out. And of course, Military Families Learning Network also has its own social media channels as well. And also, we've kind of experimented with Facebook Live. E-Extension has been housing all of our webinars and our YouTube Live videos on our own YouTube channel. So this just is a screenshot that shows some of those past presentations. And then I just want to talk about some programs that are available that are of use to everybody across the system nationwide and to our partners as well as at HHS. We have Starting Over After Foreclosure, which, as the name implies, is a program designed to help people who've been through the foreclosure process and are starting to rebuild their financial lives. We've got Recovery After Disaster, which is a program, again, helping people to rebuild, but this time it's not because of foreclosure, it's because of some kind of natural disaster like a flood or a tornado or a hurricane, something like that. So those materials are available. We have Small Steps to Health and Wealth, which is our program that integrates personal finance and health information in one program, because the program isn't so much about the content, it's about focusing on behavior change and steps that people can take. And then we have another program called Money Talk, a financial guide for women. And I'll proudly say that the new edition of our book, the 4th edition, just came out last week and is available online. And also people can buy the print copies as well. We support America Saves and Money Smart Week as a partner with those national programs. We also support the CFPB program, Your Money, Your Goals, which is operating in about 17 different states. Some of our extension faculty have been producing and archiving webinars. So we have this one called Solid Finances from our faculty in the Western states. And then we have the University of Florida IFAS webinars produced by faculty at the University of Florida. So just to kind of end up here, just encouraging everybody to kind of connect with us, folks from HHS. Please make sure that you tell your colleagues about some of the work that we're doing and how to connect with us. And if anybody has any questions or comments, be glad to answer them either now or afterwards. You can just send me an email, and be glad to share these slides with anybody as well. So I'll turn it back to Laura.
Okay, thanks everyone, panelists, Barb, Kim, Amanda, Toya. I'll go ahead and open up the Q&A. I've been responding as questions have popped up. Let's see, great info. I've had so many comments about what a great webinar this is. Thank you so much to our presenters. And as you've been presenting, you may not have noticed, but I tried to, as we went along, put in links to some of the websites and things that our presenters mentioned. So Military Family Learning Network, link is in there. The link to sign up for the BIAS newsletter is in there, along with the BIAS website and some of the web pages and materials that were mentioned in that. We are going to be posting the slides, and I can post a link to those on the Extension Learn event, along with the recording when that's ready in a few days. So that'll be available. Any other questions, feel free to put in the Q&A or the chat at this time any questions that you may have for any of our panelists today. Here's something in the Q&A. Link to recovery after a disaster, the family toolkit. That is in Barb's slides. And Barb, I'm still seeing your slides. If you could go back, can you go back to that slide with your links? This one right here. And so those are there on the slide. We'll see if we can get those in the chat for you as well. No?
I can't copy. Barb could.
Okay. Okay. So I've just been Googling those and finding them pretty quickly. So we'll have those slides available to you and see if we can get those out to you as soon as possible. What else? Any other questions? Okay, there it is in the chat. Emergency Money Management Toolkit. Thank you so much, Carrie. I appreciate that. Okay, we are coming up at the bottom of our webinar. I wanted to give another quick reminder. We have talking to Andrew Zumwalt, who is, I think, going to be, I'm waiting for him to confirm the date, but I think it's going to be our April 25th webinar presentation, talking about the new tax laws and specifically about consumer outreach education and questions that consumers have and how best to educate them. In May, we have Karim Imam, and he's going to be talking about financial education in Arabic. Some of you may have seen his poster at our last AFCPE conference. And then we have coming up in the fall, haven't scheduled a date yet, Brett Neiser with NEFI's going to be giving us an update. And we're hoping to have Lindsay from America Saves as well. Thank you all for joining today, and we'll see you in April.